Hello, reading again from Psychological Types by Carl Jung. This is part 2 of Phantasy, PH Phantasy. Okay, so we're in the middle of the definition in a nutshell, supposedly in a nutshell, but it's like 10 pages long. Okay, please watch part 1 if you haven't, because otherwise this won't make sense. So I'm just going to pick up where we left off with the reading. When we find everyday experience establishing the purposive orientation of the conscious content beyond any sort of doubt, we have absolutely no grounds to assume, in the absence of experience to the contrary, that this may not also be the case with the content of the unconscious. My experience gives me no reason at all to dispute the purposive orientation of unconscious contents. On the contrary, the cases in which a satisfactory interpretation could alone be attained through the introduction of the purposive standpoint are in the majority. I think there he's saying unconscious contents can be equal to things that are in the consciousness, in their use or value, purposiveness, that which has purpose. Unconscious contents or things that are unconscious in the psyche shouldn't necessarily be done away with just because they're unconscious. When they break into the consciousness, we shouldn't just automatically dismiss them, because there's a lot going on behind the scenes to get you to that place, and for them to break into the consciousness usually means something. Why wouldn't it? Suppose, for example, we were again to consider the vision of Saul, St. Paul, on his road to Damascus, but this time from the angle of the Pauline world mission, and were now to reach the conclusion that Saul, though a conscious persecutor of Christians, had unconsciously adopted the Christian standpoint, that he was finally brought to avow it by the increasing predominance and final eruption of the unconscious standpoint, and that his unconscious personality was constantly striving towards this goal in an instinctive apprehension of the necessity and importance of such an act. To me, this seems a more adequate explanation of the real significance of the event than a reductive interpretation to personal motives, although these latter doubtless cooperated in one form or another, since the all too human is never lacking. Similarly, the indication given in the Acts of the Apostles of a purposive interpretation of the vision of St. Peter is far more satisfying than a merely physiological and personal conjecture. To sum up, we may say that phantasy needs to be understood both causally as well as purposively. Yeah. So we're not just going to dismiss fantasies. We're going to go, okay, well, what was its cause? But also, what's its purpose? St. Peter with his vision that now you can eat whatever you want. What happened after that? What did that lead to? What was the result? What was the purpose of that fantasy? And what was the cause? It's helpful to consider all of those factors. With the causal explanation, it appears as a symptom of a physiological or personal condition, the resultant of previous occurrences, whereas in the purposive interpretation, fantasy appears as a symbol, which seeks, with the help of existing material, a clear and definite goal. It strives, as it were, to distinguish or lay hold of a certain line for the future psychological development. Don't ignore these things that pop into your mind. When the unconscious stuff finally makes itself conscious, have a look at it. What's it there for? What led to it? It might not be something that you are going to find useful or fruitful, but it might be. Active fantasy being the principal attribute of the artistic mentality. The artist is not merely a representer, he is also a creator, hence essentially an educator, since his works have the value of symbols that trace out the line of future development. Whether the actual social validity of the symbol is more general or more restricted depends upon the quality or vital capacity of the creative individuality. The more abnormal the individual, i.e., the less his general fitness for life, the more limited will be the common social value of the symbols he produces, although their value may be absolute for the individuality in question. Yeah, I so agree with that. Like, it's the idea that, the tortured artist who's so maladapted to society, and then he has these visions and fantasies, and he speaks the truth, and sort of just in bursts here and there. He says profound things in bursts here and there, but the rest of the time he's talking nonsense, or he's not getting on with people, not able to adapt to society. And it ruins his credibility. And we often say, oh, well, that's just an ad hominem fallacy. If he's speaking truth, or if what he's saying is useful, it doesn't matter that it came from him. But if it's a fantasy, it might very well matter, because you have to take into account what was it that led up to that sudden bursting of contents from the unconscious into the consciousness. If this is a maladapted person, or he's got things going on in his unconsciousness that are not healthy, what is coming through, it doesn't prove that his fantasies are gobbledygook, but you do have to. There is a good strong argument for the questioning of the source of those fantasies, and it's the same with us. Like, I often find myself questioning things. There's things that come through that are fruitful for me, they come from a healthy place, or they come from a place of understanding or experience, or even they're just something that I can use fruitfully for a time, and it's useful for now. But there's also things that come through, I have to go, I'm not really sure about that. I can sense that it comes from a place of something that's not all too wholesome. But how do we know? And also, it might be useful right now, but not in the future. Or it might be useful for you, but not other people. You kind of, you also see people running around kind of insisting that, they've had this brilliant idea and this is how it should work now, and they want everybody else to conform to that. And it's like, well, people will look at you and think that they, in the same way that you try and make judgments as to where your fantasies come from, whether it's from a healthy and fruitful place, and whether it's going to be healthy and fruitful if you carry it forward into the world, other people are also looking at you and trying to make that judgment. They're trying to see if they can trust what you say, and whether that thing comes from a healthy place or not. And it's a perfectly valid thing to do that. I also just wanted to add to that idea really quickly, the idea that the psyche is self-balancing. I've come across people who have been through hard times and they weren't brought up very well, but they have managed to become kind of functional whole people who have wisdom, and they haven't had any therapy. And you kind of think, like, how did they do it? How did they come from that to this without having any therapy? And it might be because the therapy is happening in their unconsciousness behind the scenes, and then they're having these fantasies, or they're having, these sudden bursts of inspiration, or things that are coming into the consciousness, like, aha, okay, and going forward now I'm going to incorporate that. So it's almost like if you don't get therapy, there's good chance that your psyche is going to balance itself out eventually, so that you can become less maladapted. I think that's such a nice idea. How, I mean, therapy's great. I'm an advocate of therapy, but I'm also an advocate of you know, healing yourself, or allowing your psyche to balance itself out, allowing your psyche to be healed, and there are many things that you can feed into the mind. You can educate yourself, you can read things, you can hang around with different people, you can have conversations. There's all sorts of different things, apart from therapy, that you can put into your mind, but or not, just allow the unconscious process to take place, and allow wisdom to grow that way, just through time, just through being, just through the sheer fact that the psyche is a self-balancing thing. And I really love that idea. One has no right to dispute the existence of the latent meaning of fantasy, unless we also cling to the view that the general nature process contains no satisfying meaning. But natural science has developed the meaning of the nature process into the form of natural laws. So the latent meaning means it's an existing, it has a meaning, but the meaning has not yet developed or manifested or made itself known. It's a concealed meaning. So he's saying that if fantasies happen, if you're saying that, well, that has no meaning because I don't know what the meaning is, then you could make the argument that, well, nothing means anything because we don't understand nature fully. We don't understand, the larger truths fully. That means that those truths don't exist. And he's saying, take the same attitude with your fantasies. Just because you don't understand it right now, don't just write it off as though it doesn't mean anything. The meaning might come to you later, or the idea will develop. These, admittedly, are human hypotheses advanced in explanation of the nature process, but only insofar as we have ascertained that the proposed law actually coincides with the objective process are we justified in speaking of a meaning of the natural occurrence. Just so far, therefore, as we have succeeded in demonstrating a law-abiding principle in fantasy, also we are justified in speaking of a meaning of the same. But the disclosed meaning is satisfying, or in other words, the demonstrated regularity deserves the name only when it adequately renders the nature of fantasy. There is a law-abiding regularity in the nature process, and also a regularity of the nature process. It is certainly law-determined and regular that one dreams when one sleeps. But there is no sort of law-determined principle that affirms anything about the nature of the dream. Its nature is a mere condition of the dream, the demonstration of a physiological source of the fantasy is a mere condition of its existence, not a law of its nature. The law of fantasy, as a psychological phenomenon, can only be a psychological law. We now come to the second point of our explanation of the concept of fantasy, and that is imaginative activity. Imagination is the reproduction or creative activity of the mind generally, though not a special faculty, since it may come into play in all the basic forms of psychic activity, whether thinking, feeling, sensation, or intuition. All right, that's very interesting, especially when people say that introverted intuition is to do with imagination, he's saying that actually imagination can be used in all the functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, or intuition. That's very interesting. I often wonder about that. And he's okay, so imagination is either reproductive or creative activity in the mind. So that would mean going over events that have already happened, imagining things that have already happened, or creating new things that haven't happened. Yeah, and it can be done via thinking, feeling, sensation, or intuition. Wow, that's be interesting to try and reproduce and create imaginatively using all of those functions separately and kind of seeing what they feel like. Fantasy as imaginative activity is, in my view, simply the direct expression of psychic vital activity. It is energy merely appearing in consciousness in the form of images or contents, just as physical energy also reveals itself as a definite physical state wherein sense organs are stimulated in physical ways. For as every physical state, from the energetic standpoint, is merely a dynamic system, so too a psychic content, regarded energetically, is merely a dynamic system appearing in consciousness. Hence, from this standpoint, one may affirm that fantasy in the form of phantasm is merely a definite sum of libido, which cannot appear in consciousness in any other way than in the form of an image. Phantasm is an Ide force. Anyway, Ide force is an idea considered as a real factor in the behaviour of an individual or social group, and thus in the course of events. It's an idea considered as a real factor in the behaviour of an individual or social group, and thus in the course of events. Okay, I'm going to have to read a little bit more of that. It translates to key idea. Okay. Phantasm is a key idea. Let me know if you have any ideas on how to kind of interpret that. Anyway, fantasy as imaginative activity is identical with the course of the energetic psychic process. Ah, there we go. Oh, right, okay. Woo. Right, lots to take in there. That's the key piece of information for me there was just because you're using your imagination a lot, that doesn't mean that you're using your intuition. You could be using thinking, feeling, or sensation just as much as you are intuition. So watch out for that trap. I'm going to have a think about that because I've been wondering, I feel like I use introverted intuition a lot because I use my imagination a lot, and I definitely do. And I imagine things that have happened, but a lot of the time I imagine things that could happen, like a lot, and in images as well, sometimes in words out loud, but a lot of the time in images, like imagining myself in certain scenarios, and it might be realistic, like it involves people who actually exist, or it might not be realistic, it might involve people who don't exist. And I thought that was introverted intuition, but I don't think it is. I don't think it necessarily is anyway. Yeah, anyway, so it'd be great to have some comments on my channel. Like, I'm really out of my depth with this, but I'm just really enjoying exploring it, and I'm purposefully not looking at any other videos on this book or people's interpretation of Jung, because I really just want to discover it for myself. But I'd love to have people's input and see what y'all think. All right, so anyway, thanks for listening, and hopefully see you next time.